All right, I think we can get started on our next part. Today is March 28th, a snowy day. I did not order snow. No, not so much now. But, it's also something people have been concerned about the snow, and I kind of smile a little bit because even on days where it's well below freezing, a lot of snow is melting. And you can feel the changing seasons, I think. The air has a little bit more zip to it. The sun is definitely warmer, and you notice that. And soon we'll get to have all kinds of fun with flooding. Just you wait. Y'all want it to warm up really fast, and then we'll get these warm days, and then, we'll all be panicky because of the river. Be fun to guess how long the river is going to stay high. If it'll take a month or two. A lot of it depends on how much snow they've had south of here. How much they've had in Wahpeton and some of the other places through South Dakota. All right, but we can get started. Saul preaches in Damascus, I think, is the section that we're on. So when Paul has his conversion, he stays for several days or for a period of time with the new believers in Damascus. And again, this is something that I think would be really, really challenging. If you were part of the church in Damascus and you were there, you know that Paul was coming to persecute you, like the word has gone around, and he has this conversion, and he's no longer persecuting people, but now he needs a place to stay. He needs someone to stay with. And again, for someone who's moving in the right direction, maybe it's not so hard. Like lots of you, if you really knew that someone at the church was struggling, wouldn't think too hard about opening a bedroom at your house to someone. But this was a guy who shortly before was trying to kill them. And I think it's important to see the invitation to conversion in both directions. Like Paul is having to rework his entire life and what he thought and all of his studies about the Torah and who Jesus is, and he's probably learning a lot. And at the same time, the invitation for the local community is also a stretch. Like in a way, the drastic conversion isn't just Paul alone, but it's also on the part of the people receiving him and on the part of the people hearing him. It's important to note too that it's not really clear how long he stays. Like the text doesn't give us a lot of indications, and it's hard to put together the pieces where he talks about it in other places in the New Testament. Because he'll have times where he narrates kind of a timeline, like I did this, and then I was here for this many years, and then I went there. But it's unclear if it always fits in neatly. Did he stay in Damascus the entire time? He could have, but it's also very possible that he did something else, right? Like maybe he preached or he went to the synagogues in villages around Damascus. It doesn't say that, but it would be kind of a logical thing. If you stay somewhere for 3 years, these ancient cities aren't all that big. Not like cities are now. And you'd get to know people because you practically live on top of them. Was what?
Was he married?
Paul? No. Paul is single. He talks about it being like Jesus. He talks about celibacy and those kind of things in some of his letters. I don't think anyone's ever claimed for Paul to have been married. I think he'd be kind of a hard guy to be married to. He was a little headstrong. He begins at once to proclaim. And one of the things that I think you see about Paul, and this happens quite often, is that the desire that he had, his religious fervor, is transformed by Jesus, but is more or less channeled in a new direction, not so much ended and begun again. There's a phrase in the book of Revelation where Jesus says, like, I wish that you were hot or cold, but you're lukewarm, so I spit you out. Because there's a sense that, like, if someone's moving, if a car is moving, it's relatively easy to turn. You know, you turn the steering wheel and it turns eventually and goes in the other direction. But if someone is parked and has their parking brake on, how easy is it to turn the car? You can't until you start moving. And that's kind of this experience that you see in the life of Paul and you see in the New Testament, is that it's far more important to have fervor. It's far more important to be zealous for something, because directions can change relatively easily. So sometimes you see people who have these conversions and they go from being kind of an extreme atheist to being a very fervent Christian. But it's the ones that have inertia, the ones that are stuck, the ones that are parked, the ones that, you know, well, I'm pretty good and I've been good for a long time, and so life is okay. That's a much harder attitude to deal with, because it's really hard for the message to get under your skin. It's really hard to hear it, because you have a lot of armor. It's like the soil has gotten harder on top. It's formed a crust. Paul doesn't arrest people with chains like he was planning on it, but he arrests them with his words. He must have been a fairly powerful preacher, because he starts to annoy some of the people who are set against him almost right away. They hear him and they start to question. It's hard to believe what they see with their eyes. They're sort of stuck in the background. Like, there's this note of discord. It's like the entire symphony just changed and they're hearing a new piece of music and they're wondering where the old one went. And this person who was causing lots of ruckus and clamor before and sounded like they were playing all the wrong notes is now carrying the melody. That's kind of what the people in the background, I think, are feeling about Paul. It's like they watch him, they're like, this guy was a persecutor? Or, like, is he just trying to trick us? Is he trying to sound Christian in order to get in the synagogue and trying to get into people's homes, and, you know, he's going to pull out the big guns later and go after people? But part of it is that when we believe in God, when we strive to follow Him, our backstory and our history becomes important. We can spend a lot of time in our lives being concerned and afraid of what we've done in the past and how that impacts us, or being afraid that people will find out, or different things. But in grace, God actually uses all of those moments. I mean, sometimes, for instance, people wandered away from the faith and the practice of the faith when they were in college. And they joined kind of the college lifestyle and lived a life of dissolution for a while. And they can be very embarrassed about that, and very embarrassed about their past and the choices that they made. But in a lot of cases, it's amazing to see how, either with their own kids or with people later, your story of working through that and your story of coming to faith and the story of conversion behind that often becomes a powerful witness. It becomes something that lends credibility to your message. sometimes people think of priests or seminarians like, how can you know much about the world? You left high school or went to seminary, and you get questions like that sometimes. And the reality is you learn a lot about it because people share it with you. Their backstories, your backstories, the areas in your life that have been sinful. It's not that they become good in the sense that sinning is good, but God can certainly use them to help inspire other people. That can lend a lot of credibility to your message. And I think Paul comes to rely on that. He is a big fan of the fact that all of this happened because now that they can see him preaching, now that they can see him sort of channeling his zeal for Christ, that backstory and that history and his persecution of the church and his moment of conversion become a powerful witness of the grace of God. And so when it comes to history, it's good to try and relax a little bit and to let go of the fear and let go of this concern that somehow if I tell people about what's happened in my life, they're going to judge me, or they're going to be afraid, or they're going to, do X, Y, and Z. They might, but they might not. Like, your story and your history might actually be an inspiration to them. As a priest, we have this all the time, and it's interesting and hard to try and find the balance of, coloring or adding some of your own stories and the things that you've learned to things like homilies and when you're teaching. Because, for myself, it's like I don't want it to be about me, and I don't want to be the center of attention, but I also know that my history and the challenges that I've faced and the questions that I've tackled are important to people. And so there is a balance between proclaiming the message and teaching about Jesus and also sharing the impact of that on yourself. But even some of the wanderings that I've done, like in high school, I've come to see now how God has used them in beautiful ways. And I think that same thing can happen for you and becomes a powerful witness. And at the end of this section, I think our author of the commentary talks about the importance of the mission of God and a vocation. That God calls people to follow him. He calls people to a life of surrender, and you never quite know where that life of surrender is going to lead. And I think for people who are in the later stages of life, it's easy in a sense to get caught up in, well, my vocation is complete. Like, I got married, I raised a family, this was the call of God for me, I responded to it more or less well, and now I'm just kind of in these sunsetting years. But there's all kinds of beautiful stories about how that isn't true. That God still calls. And the call might be different and the invitation might be different. You might not be the same kind of missionary that Paul was, and you might not go out and run a marathon. But think of the story, for instance, of Simeon and Anna in the birth of Jesus. It talks about them both being very old, that they had prayed for a long time for the consolation of Israel, and they were two of the people who got to encounter Jesus as the Messiah when he was a baby. And there's very few of them. I mean, other than Mary and Joseph and a handful of shepherds and the wise men, it sounds like they didn't tell a lot of people about the birth of Jesus, that they just kind of kept the story as a family thing. They kept the story. I mean, maybe Elizabeth and Zechariah and John the Baptist, they might have known. But, Simeon and Anna encounter Jesus in the temple, and that's a beautiful thing. So I would encourage you that even at this point in your life, it's still important to ask, where is God calling me? where is he leading me? Because that leading might be different. It might be to dedicate your time to prayer. It might be to minister in a different way. It will fit in the context of the vocation that you have. But God isn't done with you yet. And he's not done with me yet. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities that could come your way, especially when your heart is open, and I think that's so important. God calls lots of people. Like, remember that these were fishermen, these were persecutors, these were people who were hesitant, these were people that didn't have everything put together. You think of some of the miracles of Jesus, like when he heals the demoniac in the region of the Decapolis on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. Like, he heals the guy, and he says, the guy wants to follow him, and Jesus says, no, you have to go home. Go back to your family. He was possessed by a demon for years and lived in the tombs and pulled off chains. You think that his life is completely put back together? Nope. And Jesus still calls him, but in his case, his mission was to go back to his family and to tell other people that his history too, and the encounter with Jesus bears witness to what Jesus is doing. And that can be a strong point of humility, that it keeps you humble when you have those kind of conversion moments. But don't count yourself out just because you're not X, Y, and Z. I'm not one who has learned a lot. I'm not this kind of person. God doesn't seem to mind. So then Saul visits Jerusalem. He goes to Jerusalem. It's likely that his preaching was effective, that in this Hellenistic community especially. And the Hellenistic community is what?
Greek.
They're the Greek-speaking Jews, probably. Now, do you think some Gentiles are hearing the message? Yeah. Paul is a strong preacher. If he's debating people in the synagogue, I don't think he probably stood in the synagogue every time he did. Sometimes I think he would be walking to the market and he'd get in discussions with people or something like that. Right? Like, there's a life that's behind this. I mean, Paul doesn't, wake up in the morning and go to synagogue and stay there all day with all kinds of people and go home, and then wake up in the morning and go back to the synagogue and stay there all day and then go home. Because, why? Well, part of it could be because he doesn't have a home, but he's staying with someone. But what about the part of the people who's listening to him? Think of something really obvious.
Well, they have to work and eat.
Yes, they have the rest of their life. They're not at the synagogue all the time. They have to work, they have to eat, they have to, sure, Paul is interesting, but someone's got to make the food. You can't just stay at the synagogue forever. And even if there are a few that would, they're inspired by Paul and they're listening to him for a day or two, eventually they have to go back to work. You can't just skip work forever, because in a lot of cases in the ancient world, they weren't, part of the giant Walmart corporation with a massive schedule. It was like, maybe there were a handful of people in a trade together, but very often, your workshop was attached to your house. And if you didn't go to work, you didn't make any money because no one was working. It seems like at this point, Paul may have gone to Arabia. And this is important because later he'll say that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. And this causes all kinds of problems because the ancient world doesn't refer to the Sinai Peninsula, which is a traditional location of Mount Sinai, as Arabia. Arabia would be like Saudi Arabia and further east. And there is a puzzle that they've done some excavations around the traditional site of Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, where St. Catherine's Monastery is, and they haven't been able to find evidence that a large group of people lived there for some time. Because when people are around in the ancient world, there's a mess, and the mess eventually gets buried under sand. So it's like they find broken pots, and they find remains of fires, and all of these different things that you have that are a part of life. People didn't take all their broken pots with them. And it's a very dry area. But it's likely, at least for Paul, what it's saying is that he probably went to Mount Sinai. He goes to Arabia. Why would Paul go to Mount Sinai?
He's a Pharisee and the Mosaic law.
Because he was a Pharisee and the Mosaic law. Yes. I think also because Mount Sinai was the place of the covenant. The covenant that at this point he spent most of his life following and he treasured. He probably goes there to learn and to rethink and to pray. But he preaches in Damascus. If you start putting together the timelines, it sounds like he preaches in Damascus for 3 years. If you read the text, you don't really have that impression that this is happening for 3 years. Like, oh, that's a much longer time than it sounds like when you're reading. He seems to be in extended arguments with the Jews at this point, or particularly these Hellenistic Jews, and these people that are facing the tension. There's a lot of tension in the New Testament as to how to follow Jesus. Does following Jesus require people to follow the Mosaic law? And there's all kinds of tension around that. It's going to come to a head in the next several chapters, and the apostles are going to have a big debate about it in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. We believe that that council in Jerusalem happens in 50 AD. So we're 20 years, give or take, after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And the people that he's preaching to, these Hellenistic Jews, eventually conspire to kill him. Now, what does that rhyme with in the story? Who did they last conspire to kill? Not quite. You're close. Stephen. And before Stephen, Jesus. And you can see how it's kind of repeating the same pattern. They're concerned about someone breaking the Mosaic law or living the Mosaic law in a way that they don't like, that violates their tradition, but they're very willing to kill them. And murder is against the Mosaic law. That's against one of those big laws, those 10 commandments. And so, Paul ends up having to be lowered through a hole in the wall or a window. Now, it's important to know that cities in the ancient world were not spread out monstrosities like Fargo. Fargo, for the number of people that it has, is enormously huge. It is very, very spread out. It's not a dense city at all. In the ancient world, cities were much denser because cities were surrounded by a wall. So even ancient Rome, like much of ancient Rome, isn't that large. The walls that are around Jerusalem now, if you go and they call it the Old City, there was a time when the Old City now is over twice the size of the Old City when Jesus was there. And when Jesus was there, it was a town or a city probably of between 50 and 100,000 people. And it would only take maybe 10 or 15 minutes to walk across, if that. Even now, from one end of the Old City to the other, I think is only a kilometer or just over half a mile. And in the other direction, it's probably less than a kilometer. And the city of Jesus was like half of that size, and it probably still had 50,000 or 100,000 people that lived there. So we have this misconception of space. It's even funny when you go to ancient cities like ancient Rome, for instance, is much, much smaller than the modern city. In fact, St. Peter's Basilica isn't in ancient Rome. That was outside the walls of the city. And if you go to the Vatican, it's part of the reason why there's like this wall, this weird wall that's built around it on the outside, because it was outside the walls of the city. And I think some of that wall is old, like this. So cities were walled. You lived inside the wall, and they were relatively cramped. They were probably dirty and smelly because they didn't have plumbing. They didn't have indoor plumbing, at least in this kind of area. And there would only be a few gates in the wall, and none of the gates are very big. Why would none of the gates be very big? What?
Because they were very big people.
No.
The enemy,
Easier to
keep
defend.
the enemy out.
They're easier to defend. You wanted to keep enemy armies from getting in. Walls are made to keep people out. And so the holes in your wall were always the weak places. That's why they often built a gatehouse around it. If you go to castles all over Europe, you see this. Like they have a gate, but there is a gatehouse or a tower that's built around the gate so that you can protect the gate because it's the weak point. So Paul is lowered through this hole in the wall. He's sort of chucked out in a bucket. Now, if you were Paul, how would you feel about that? You would feel frightened. Why frightened? You're not sure what's on the other side of the wall? Yeah, I think that would be part of it. What else?
Probably humiliated
Humiliated. Why humiliated?
because he has to leave quickly and in private. And he's maybe thinking he's running away.
So that could be part of it, that he could feel like he's running away. But I think there's also another emotion that's probably behind it as well.
Where do I go?
Where do I go? He could be wondering that, yeah. But
Am I losing my influence?
losing influence, he might have been thinking that. But there's another direction I think we have to consider.
Trusting the guys that are letting you know.
Trusting the guys that are letting you down, but he probably does. What happens, the piece of this that I think is very important, is that this isn't the kind of thing that you do normally, right? You don't evacuate from a city in the middle of the night by being lowered through a hole in the wall in a bucket, unless
People are trying to kill you.
unless you're afraid for your life, unless you're desperate. And so I think you used a lot of good words, and you see how important and how full the emotions of this kind of moment are. It could be losing influence, it could be that, but I think it's also he's afraid and he's desperate. And if you've ever been in a situation where you're actually fearing for your life, it's traumatic. Like, this isn't an easy thing. This is the kind of anxiety that paralyzes people. I have an uncle who is a priest, and he lived and worked for a while. He lived in, I want to say he lived in El Paso and worked in, maybe he lived in Laredo. I forget exactly where it is. But he lived on the U.S. side of the Mexican border, but he worked across the border in Mexico. And over the time, people had collected money for the church that he was at to redo or to pave their parking lot or something. There was something with a parking lot that they had collected this money for. and the narco traffickers found out about it and threatened his life. They like broke into the rectory and held him at knife point, and if you didn't give us the money by this day, we were going to kill you. And so he left all of his stuff and took off in the middle of the night one time and had to spend, several months kind of recovering from the trauma of that. So this is probably the experience of Paul. If you're like that, if you feel like the narcos are coming to get you, you start to have anxiety and fear constantly. You're on edge. Like when people walk out of the shadows, when you see things, and it could just be an innocent thing like a kid running by, but it could also be someone who's spying on you and, reporting back to the people threatening your life. That's probably what Paul is going through. A very, very real, very, very visceral, direct kind of fear. He is invited to turn toward the Lord and trust. I mean, this kind of moment is not an easy thing. If you live with that kind of fear, to say, like, I believe in God, He is my shepherd, that's a pretty strong statement of faith. That's not just something that comes naturally. When you are that afraid, when I am that afraid, we often start trying to control things. We start trying to put our life in order. And for people that are in a situation where you can't control and it keeps getting worse, it actually spirals downward pretty quickly when you try to control things and it doesn't happen. I think this experience shows us the wisdom that even for Paul, like boldly jumping into the town square, like kill me for Jesus, isn't always the right answer. That Paul or God or the Holy Spirit, someone knows and has told him or suggested to him or drawn his attention to, now is not the time where God is calling you to give your life. Now is the time to run away. Sometimes evil does have to be confronted head on, and sometimes it's better to wait for the right time. That waiting isn't always the wrong answer. The people that are with him were probably almost beside themselves with anxiety and praying for him a lot. They're praying for his success. They're praying for his survival because, like you said, you don't always know. And outside the cities, there were often bandits and robbers along the road. Like, part of the reason that Christianity was able to spread is because there was the Roman Empire at this time. And the Roman Empire meant that they protected the main roads. There were garrisons of soldiers every so many miles. And so if the robbers came out, the soldiers would come and get them. And you didn't want to be on the sharp end of a Roman sword. That usually didn't go well for you. But it's important, I think, to allow Paul and to allow the Christian community to be human. Sometimes it's like Paul is this bold, lion-eyed defender of the church, who proclaims the message anywhere and is like, come and get me, hear me roar.